People say revenge is a dish best served cold. Mine was served at exactly 98.6 degrees Celsius, paired with blaring fire alarms and a $2 billion penalty. Men in $3,000 suits think power lies in titles and golf course handshakes. They forget that real power belongs to whoever holds the server passwords and automated scripts. Pour yourself some wine. You are about to witness a symphony of ruin orchestrated by my single click. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank you for always being here with us. But I must honestly share that YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero operating budget to keep going. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon, where you will unlock exclusive, incredibly detailed true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that are simply too intense to publish publicly here on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment. Now, let us dive right into today's corporate nightmare. And my name is Ruby Bennett. I am 34 years old, working as a data infrastructure audit specialist at EtherCore Dynamics. To the outside world, EtherCore is just a massive windowless fortress of concrete and steel sitting heavily in the technology valley. But on the inside, it is the beating heart of the West Coast. We house the most highly classified data for the largest medical conglomerates and top-tier financial institutions in the country. It is a high-tech, suffocatingly sterile environment where absolute perfection is not just expected. It is the bare minimum required to keep your security badge. The temperature in the server floors is always kept chillingly cold, contrasting sharply with the heated, toxic arrogance radiating from the executive suites upstairs. My job is to monitor that coldness, ensuring everything runs flawlessly in the background. That Tuesday morning began like any other, until my diagnostic monitors flagged a critical anomaly originating from server area alpha. The core temperatures were spiking aggressively, already exceeding the maximum safety limit by 15% and climbing steadily. In a data center, heat is the ultimate enemy. This was not a random hardware glitch or a sensor malfunction. I rapidly pulled the system logs and saw exactly what was happening behind the scenes. The primary cooling systems were being deliberately throttled down, forced to run drastically under their required capacity. The reason was entirely financial. It was a direct, reckless override authorized by Lance Sterling, our vice president of operations. Lance was the kind of man who measured his worth by the sharpness of his tailored suits and his aggressive golf swings. He had intentionally choked the cooling systems just to slash operational overhead, desperately trying to shave a few fractions of a cent off the energy bill to make his quarterly financial reports look attractive for the board of directors. I did not waste a single second. I grabbed my diagnostic tablet, the screen glowing brightly with a harsh red thermal map of Area Alpha, and marched straight out of the control room. I tracked his location and intercepted Lance right in the middle of the main glass hallway. He was strutting confidently at the front of a guided tour group, leading a dozen VIP investors and potential high-net-worth clients, pointing out our supposedly flawless and secure infrastructure. I stepped directly into his path, forcing the entire wealthy entourage to a sudden halt. I held up the tablet and looked him dead in the eye. I spoke with absolute calm, my voice steady and strictly professional, warning him that we were facing an imminent catastrophic fire risk if the backup liquid cooling protocol was not manually restarted that very instant. Lance stopped in his tracks, his posture stiffening with irritation. He looked at me, then turned his head to share a mocking smirk with his elite guests, making sure they were all in on the joke. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down and took the end of his $3,000 imported silk tie. He stepped closer, leaned his heavy frame over my tablet, and began wiping the expensive silk across my glowing screen. Mocking the motion of cleaning away a dirty smudge left by an incompetent employee, he let out a loud, patronizing sigh and spoke with a voice dripping in condescension. "Don't overreact, sweetie. Just be a good girl. Go back to your desk and type up your spreadsheets. Leave the machines to the men." The entire group of executives erupted into booming, synchronized laughter. It echoed sharply off the sterile glass walls. A vicious chorus of men amused by the little technical girl panicking over nothing. I did not blink. My face did not flush red. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of protest to defend my pride. I just stood perfectly still, my posture completely rigid, my eyes locked entirely onto his smug, deeply satisfied smile. I let the humiliating laughter wash over me for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, I firmly pulled my tablet back to my chest, turned on my heel, and walked away down the long corridor while their mocking chuckles continued to follow me. Let them laugh. I walked back to my desk with a mind full of absolute crystal-clear calculation, what Lance Sterling did not know, and what I deliberately chose not to tell him in that hallway, was the exact nature of the hardware currently roasting inside Area Alpha. That specific sector was exclusively storing the entire, unbacked-up internal transaction data of a major federal bank. A massive server migration was actively in progress, meaning there was absolutely zero redundancy in place. If Area Alpha burned, the bank's entire daily ledger burned to ashes with it. Even better, my brief dive into the system logs earlier that morning had already secured undeniable, heavily encrypted proof that Lance had intentionally disabled the critical safety alarm protocols on the centralized dashboard to hide his little cost-saving stunt. He thought he had silenced the warnings and secured his promotion. He had only ensured his own total destruction. I pulled out of the EtherCore Dynamics parking lot at exactly 3:30 in the afternoon. The glaring afternoon sun bounced off the concrete, a stark contrast to the artificially chilled air I had just left behind. Reaching over to the passenger seat, I picked up my corporate smartphone, held the power button down, and watched the screen fade to an absolute black. I tossed it into the glove compartment. The silence in my car was immediate and profound. I turned the key, letting the smooth, unpredictable rhythms of a vintage jazz saxophone fill the cabin. It was the perfect soundtrack for a getaway. On my way home, I made a mundane stop at the local neighborhood supermarket. I walked down the brightly lit frozen food aisle, my footsteps slow and deliberate, and picked out a family-sized tray of frozen meat lasagna. There is a deeply unsettling tranquility that washes over you when you possess the absolute certainty that the monolithic structure you just walked away from is quietly transforming into an inescapable inferno. My apartment was a small, unassuming space on the 4th floor, far removed from the sterile grandeur of the Tech Valley. I kicked off my stiff corporate heels, shedding the restrictive layers of my workday attire for a worn-out oversized sweater and loose cotton pants. I peeled the plastic film off the lasagna, shoved the plastic tray into the microwave, and punched in the heating time. While the low hum of the appliance filled the kitchen, I sat down at my small wooden dining table and flipped open my personal laptop. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dim room. It did not boot into a standard desktop. Instead, it loaded a secure, encrypted terminal window displaying a digital countdown timer. I had built this hidden portal exactly 3 months ago. On the very afternoon my first formal risk assessment report was casually tossed into the shredder by upper management. Miles away, back inside the glass walls of the executive suites, Lance was undoubtedly commanding the room. He was scheduled to deliver his quarterly presentation to the board of directors right about now. I could almost picture him pacing the plush carpeting, gesturing expansively with his expensive pen, throwing around empty corporate buzzwords like profit optimization and aggressive margin reduction. He was putting on a masterclass in deception, feeling completely invincible. He genuinely believed that his top-tier administrative privileges were functioning perfectly as a digital curtain, completely obscuring the real, skyrocketing thermal metrics of the Alpha sector from the Central Command dashboard. He was wrong. He was so blindingly wrong. I brought up the command line and began configuring a highly specialized cron job. This was not going to be a standard internal ticket. My final diagnostic report was not being routed to Lance, nor was it going to the helpless information technology support desk, where it could be quietly intercepted and deleted. Instead, I established an automated, unbreakable outbound relay. The destination list was unalterable and terrifyingly final. The encrypted data packets were aimed directly at the private inboxes of the EtherCore Board of Directors, the Regional Enforcement Division of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission, and the primary underwriters at our cyber risk insurance provider. Once the script executed, there would be no taking it back. To ensure the narrative was completely bulletproof, I attached the ultimate payload. It was a comprehensive directory of system logs I had carefully harvested over the past week. These files contained undeniable digital fingerprints, proving Lance had secretly authorized payment to an unvetted, off-the-books external contractor. This rogue engineer had been brought in to inject a highly sophisticated spoofing script deep into our monitoring software. The malicious code was designed to continuously feed fabricated, perfectly normal temperature readings back to the main hub, completely masking the reality that the primary cooling infrastructure had been forcibly starved of power. The red digital numbers on my kitchen clock shifted to 4:58 in the afternoon. The microwave let out 3 sharp, piercing beeps. I pushed my chair back, walked over to the counter, and pulled the steaming tray of lasagna from the rotating glass plate. I grabbed a tall glass from the cabinet and filled it with ice-cold filtered water. Walking back to the table, I set the food down and kept my eyes locked entirely on the laptop screen. The timer ticked down its final seconds. The clock on the wall audibly clicked over to 4:59 in the afternoon. A single line of bright neon green text materialized across the black terminal window. Payload delivered. I picked up my fork, cut a small piece of the hot pasta, and took my very first bite. Everything had finally begun. At exactly 12 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, the physical reality of thermodynamics finally caught up with corporate greed. Deep within the subterranean levels of the facility, the very last functional thermal sensor anchored inside Area Alpha reached its absolute breaking point. The ambient heat had grown so intensely aggressive that the protective plastic casing around the delicate silicon thermometer literally warped, bubbled, and completely melted away. Without that final line of telemetry, the centralized monitoring system was flying completely blind. Seconds later, a pressurized valve within the main liquid cooling manifold, already fatally weakened by the artificial throttling, violently ruptured under the immense thermal stress. A highly conductive spray of synthetic coolant burst outward, raining down directly onto the exposed, superheated circuit boards of the primary data arrays. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and entirely unforgiving. A massive, cascading short circuit ripped through the hardware. 3 colossal server racks, dense metallic towers holding tens of millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge proprietary technology, ignited simultaneously in a brilliant, terrifying flash of blue electrical arcing and thick, highly toxic black smoke. The synthetic materials fueling the flame burned with a vicious, hungry intensity. Immediately, the automated environmental defense mechanisms awoke from their dormant state. The heavy reinforced steel blast doors sealing the basement slammed shut with a deafening, bone-rattling thud, hermetically locking down the entire subterranean floor to contain the inferno. From the ceiling vents, a massive payload of halon fire suppression gas was violently discharged, designed to completely starve the room of oxygen, above ground. The monolithic silence of the building was brutally shattered as the main emergency sirens began to scream, their blaring, high-pitched wails tearing through the pristine glass corridors like physical blows. 3 floors up, wrapped in the insulated luxury of the VIP executive suite, Lance was holding court. He stood tall, a delicate crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne raised high in his right hand, mid-sentence in a boastful toast to his wealthy clients. He never got to finish his sentence. The warm, elegant ambient lighting of the suite flickered once, violently, before dying completely. The room was plunged into a split second of total darkness before the harsh, unforgiving, blood-red glare of the emergency strobe lights kicked in, painting the terrified faces of his elite guests in a rhythmic, pulsing crimson. Lance spun around, abruptly dropping his champagne glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, but the sound was completely drowned out by the screaming alarms. He stared in absolute horror at the massive, wall-mounted presentation monitors behind him. His sleek, carefully curated financial slideshow had been forcefully overwritten. The screens were now vomiting an endless, rapidly scrolling waterfall of fatal system errors. Dead center, pulsing in a massive, bold red font, was a single catastrophic message alerting him to a total, unrecoverable loss of connection to the federal bank's entire encrypted database. Absolute pandemonium consumed the facility. Hundreds of highly paid employees, accustomed to a life of quiet keystrokes and temperature-controlled comfort, were suddenly shoved into a state of primal panic. Security personnel shouted over the deafening sirens, forcing a massive, chaotic evacuation down the narrow emergency stairwells. In the secondary office wings, the overhead water sprinklers falsely triggered, unleashing a torrential, artificial rainstorm that ruined expensive tailored suits and soaked thousands of physical documents. The local city fire department breached the main security gates in less than 10 minutes. A small army of heavily geared first responders rushing into the flooded, panicked lobby. Fortunately, the aggressive lockdown protocols meant not a single human life was lost. There were absolutely no injuries, but the financial and digital slaughter was absolute. The immediate destruction of the physical hardware was catastrophic enough. But the instantaneous vaporization of unbacked federal banking data pushed the estimated damages into an unimaginable, astronomical number. It was a localized apocalypse. Miles away, completely removed from the suffocating smoke and the screaming sirens, I was comfortably stretched out on my soft living room sofa. The ambient lighting in my apartment was warm and inviting. I had my legs propped up on a plush velvet cushion, lazily watching a dramatic reality cooking competition on my large screen television. The volume was set just high enough to drown out the distant traffic. Inside the top wooden drawer of my side table, my corporate smartphone suddenly came alive. It began to vibrate with a violent, relentless intensity, rattling aggressively against the hard wood like a venomous scorpion desperately trying to claw its way out of a sealed glass jar. It buzzed once, paused, then began a continuous, frantic vibration as the automated emergency notification system desperately tried to reach the lead infrastructure auditor. I did not move a single muscle to open that drawer. I did not even turn my head away from the screen. I simply took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced water and watched an arrogant chef on the television completely break down over a ruined, collapsed soufflé. Back at the tech campus, the cold, hard reality of the situation was finally hitting the upper echelon of management. Shivering in the damp, crowded parking lot beneath the frantic red and blue lights of the fire engines, the top executives and board members were instinctively pulling out their personal phones. They were desperately searching for answers to the chaos, and they found them waiting perfectly in their secure inboxes. It was the delayed detonation of my digital payload. They opened the highly encrypted emails, all permanently time-stamped at exactly 4:59 in the afternoon. Standing in the cold night air, their eyes frantically scanned my meticulously documented warnings. They read the exact, undeniable coordinates of the disaster zone, pointing precisely to Area Alpha. They read the detailed thermal analysis predicting the exact timeline of the hardware meltdown. But most importantly, as the acrid smell of burning silicon wafted out from the subterranean vents into the night sky, they read the undeniable, system-logged proof of exactly why this tragedy had occurred. They read the name of the man who had deliberately choked the life out of the cooling systems to save a few pennies. They read the name of the man who had forced their empire to burn, Lance Sterling. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the physical fire might have been contained, but the corporate inferno was just igniting. An emergency video conference was hastily convened by our chief executive officer and the entire senior legal team. I logged into the virtual meeting room with my camera strictly disabled and my microphone firmly muted, sitting back in the comfortable shadows of my living room like a silent ghost observing a digital execution. On the main grid, Lance's video feed flickered to life. The sharp, immaculate, untouchable vice president from this morning was completely gone. In his place sat a crumbling, terrified man. His face was drenched in a thick layer of cold sweat, his skin pale and greasy. That expensive imported silk tie he had used to disrespect me was now violently loosened, hanging off his neck like a frayed noose. Behind him, through the small window of whatever temporary command trailer he had commandeered in the parking lot, the frantic, rhythmic flashing of red and blue emergency lights painted his panicked face in a pathetic, pulsing glow. Lance immediately went on the offensive, launching into a desperate, meticulously fabricated monologue to save his own skin. It was truly a masterclass in cowardice and manipulation. He aggressively pointed his trembling finger at the webcam, loudly blaming a catastrophic, unprecedented hardware defect from our primary server manufacturers. When the chief executive officer remained absolutely stone-faced, Lance pivoted his strategy, digging an even deeper hole for himself. He began wildly suggesting that EtherCore had been the victim of a highly sophisticated, malicious cyber attack. He had the absolute audacity to claim that these imaginary hackers had breached the firewall through a critical security vulnerability directly managed by my infrastructure auditing department. He was desperately attempting to build a narrative where he was the valiant, overworked commander fighting an unforeseeable war, rather than the greedy, arrogant architect of the entire disaster. He leaned closer to his screen, his voice shaking but attempting to project unyielding authority. He confidently swore on his professional reputation that the Central Command dashboard had consistently displayed perfectly stable, completely normal temperature metrics throughout the entire day. He stated, with absolute, unwavering conviction, that he had never received a single distress signal, verbal warning, or diagnostic alert from any of his subordinates regarding the cooling systems. He painted a flawless picture of total operational stability that was violently interrupted by uncontrollable outside forces. Watching him weave this fragile, pathetic tapestry of lies was incredibly satisfying. He was so deeply arrogant that he fundamentally believed his own fabricated reality could simply overwrite hard, encrypted digital facts. The video grid shifted slightly as the chief legal counsel unmuted his microphone. The corporate lawyer was an older, terrifyingly calm man who did not tolerate cheap corporate theater. He slowly adjusted his glasses, looked down at a freshly printed document resting on his desk, and let a suffocating and heavy silence hang in the virtual room for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, his voice cut through the digital static, sharp and precise as a surgical scalpel. If the systems were perfectly normal, Mr. Sterling, then what exactly is the nature of the highly detailed emergency infrastructure report submitted at exactly 4:59 in the afternoon by Miss Bennett? Lance visibly stopped breathing. His jaw went entirely slack. The remaining color drained completely from his already pale face, leaving him looking like a freshly reanimated corpse. He had been so utterly consumed with the physical chaos of the fire engines, the screaming sirens, and managing his terrified wealthy guests that he had not even bothered to check his executive inbox. He had absolutely no idea that the federal regulators, the corporate board of directors, and the insurance underwriters had been sitting on a perfectly documented, irrefutable autopsy of his negligence for the past 2 hours. The fragile illusion of his control shattered instantly in front of everyone. Desperation is a highly predictable emotion. On his video feed, I could see his eyes darting frantically to the left, focusing intensely on an off-camera secondary monitor. The blue reflection in his glasses betrayed his rapid, panicked keystrokes. He was stealthily attempting to access the main company mainframe through his top-tier administrative portal. In his mind, he was still the untouchable king of the network. He genuinely believed he could just log in, locate the root directory, and permanently purge my outbound report from the mail servers before the legal team could independently verify the forensic system logs. He was foolishly trying to erase history in real time. But a king without a kingdom is just a desperate man pressing useless plastic keys. He did not know that hours ago, long before the first spark had even caught in the basement. I had quietly slipped into the administrative registry and silently, permanently downgraded his security clearance to absolute zero. Lance hammered the enter key on his secondary keyboard. I did not need to see his screen to know exactly what was manifesting in front of him. I had written the automated protocol myself. Instead of the familiar, welcoming administrative console giving him total control, Lance was abruptly met with a solid, inescapable wall of bright, glaring red text that locked down his entire workstation. He froze, his hands hovering lifelessly over the keyboard as he read the fatal message that ended his career. Access denied. You are under internal investigation. At exactly 8:30 in the morning the following day, I stepped through the main sliding glass doors of the EtherCore Dynamics global headquarters. The acrid, unmistakable scent of burned synthetic plastic and scorched copper wiring still hung heavily in the lobby air, a lingering ghost of the absolute devastation that lay beneath our feet. I was dressed for an execution. My perfectly tailored, charcoal gray business suit possessed razor-sharp lines, and my black leather high heels struck the polished white marble floor with cold, rhythmic, unrelenting precision. The main atrium was filled with chaotic energy, packed with frantic support staff, anxious middle managers, and exhausted emergency responders. Yet, as I walked through the crowd, a profound silence parted the sea of panicked employees. Every single pair of eyes locked onto me. They did not look at me with anger or confusion. They looked at me with the sheer, unadulterated terror usually reserved for the grim reaper holding a freshly sharpened scythe. They all knew exactly whose name was attached to the digital autopsy report that had frozen the company overnight. I bypassed the chaotic temporary reception desk and walked directly toward the restricted executive elevators. Swiping my badge to access the top floor, I stepped out into the heavily guarded administrative wing and made my way straight to the primary glass-enclosed conference room at the end of the hall. Through the transparent walls, I could already see them waiting for me. The chief executive officer looked as though he had aged 10 years overnight, his head buried in his hands. The chief legal counsel sat perfectly still, radiating a terrifying, calculating energy. And then there was Lance. He was practically vibrating out of his seat, a caged, desperate animal cornered by his own monumental arrogance. The moment my hand pushed the heavy glass door open, the room erupted. Lance violently shoved his chair back, the metal legs screeching harshly against the floor. He leaped to his feet, his face twisted in a pathetic mixture of blind rage and absolute panic. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, spit flying from his lips as he began to scream wildly. He frantically accused me of orchestrating the entire disaster. He yelled that I had deliberately colluded with outside hackers to physically sabotage the cooling infrastructure, claiming I had engineered this catastrophic failure specifically to destroy his flawless career and frame him for a crime he did not commit. He was breathless, red in the face, completely losing any remaining shred of his corporate composure as he desperately tried to project his guilt onto me. I did not offer him a single syllable in response. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact, and I did not bother to defend myself against his ridiculous, unhinged accusations. I simply walked over to the head of the massive oak conference table. Reaching into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, I pulled out a small, heavily encrypted titanium flash drive. I plugged it smoothly into the central presentation terminal and mirrored my interface to the massive projector screen dominating the wall behind the executives. The room fell into an uneasy, suffocating silence as I calmly opened the first directory. You stated last night, on the official legal record, that you received absolutely no warning regarding the thermal anomalies, and you claimed all systems reported normal, I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying the chilling authority of an absolute truth. Unfortunately for you, the physical security cameras monitoring the primary glass corridor outside the server room are equipped with high-fidelity directional microphones, a recent upgrade authorized by your own security budget. I clicked a single audio file. The high-quality recording filled the tense conference room. It was not a digital log or a complicated spreadsheet. It was the undeniable, crystal clear sound of his own smug voice from yesterday afternoon. Everyone in the room distinctly heard my calm, professional warning about the imminent fire risk, and then they heard his fatal response play out loudly from the surround sound speakers. They heard the condescending sigh, the rustle of his expensive silk tie, and the exact, patronizing words that sealed his fate. "Don't overreact, sweetie. Just be a good girl. Go back to your desk and type up your spreadsheets. Leave the machines to the men." The silence that followed the audio playback was heavy enough to crush bones. The chief executive officer slowly looked up, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. Lance's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent shade of white. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. His grand, aggressive defense of hacking and sabotage evaporated into thin air, entirely destroyed by his own undeniable arrogance. But I was not finished. The first twist only proved his negligence and his toxic behavior. I was there to prove his absolute criminality. I tapped the keyboard again, bringing up the second piece of my presentation. The screen shifted from an audio player to hundreds of lines of complex, color-coded programming logic. "This," I stated, tapping the screen with a laser pointer, "is the exact, uncompiled source code of the malicious spoofing script that forcefully blinded our central temperature dashboard yesterday. It is highly sophisticated, custom-built malware designed to continuously feed fabricated data to the upper management interfaces while the servers physically melted down." Lance began to breathe heavily, a shallow, wheezing sound escaping his chest as he realized exactly what I was about to show them. "When I isolated the malware, I did not just stop the execution," I continued, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "I ran a deep forensic trace on the deployment packet. This malicious code was not uploaded from an anonymous offshore proxy server or a sophisticated foreign hacker group. It was manually pushed into our internal network via a remote access portal." I clicked the final slide, displaying a single, brightly highlighted string of numbers. "This is the exact Internet Protocol address that uploaded the virus. It perfectly matches the registered static Internet Protocol address of the personal residential network installed at your private home in the suburbs." It was a flawless, irrefutable checkmate. There was no maneuvering out of this. He had paid an outsider to build the weapon, but he had fired it from his own living room to ensure it bypassed our external security firewalls. The chief executive officer literally collapsed backward into his leather ergonomic chair, all the remaining strength leaving his body. The magnitude of the situation finally crashed down on him. The damage was no longer just about melted servers or lost hardware. The chief legal counsel leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of any emotion, and delivered the killing blow to the room. He coldly announced that the federal banking institution had just officially served EtherCore with a catastrophic lawsuit for gross negligence and willful concealment of systemic risks. Furthermore, the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission had formally announced they were stepping in by noon to launch a full criminal investigation into the fraudulent manipulation of our quarterly operational reports. Lance had not just burned down a server room, he had brought a multi-billion-dollar empire to its absolute knees. All the aggressive bravado, the $3,000 suits, and the golf course confidence vanished entirely from Lance Sterling. He began to physically tremble. His legs gave out, and he sank heavily back into his chair. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely filled with tears of sheer panic. He clasped his sweating hands together, pleading in a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. He desperately tried to blame the immense pressure from the upper management for revenue growth. He clawed hopelessly at the last remaining shreds of his dignity. "Ruby, please," he begged, his voice cracking pitifully. "Please, we can settle this internally. We can fix this. Just keep the logs contained." I stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I looked down at the absolute ruin of a man who had once thought he could wipe his shoes on my intellect. I let his pathetic begging hang in the air for a long, agonizing moment. Then, I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table. I looked straight into his red, tear-filled eyes, allowing a slow, sharp, and deeply satisfied smirk to finally cross my face. "I liked it better when you called me sweetie." The chief legal counsel, a man who had built his entire highly paid career on intimidating vulnerable people into absolute submission, was visibly sweating through his tailored dress shirt. A thick, nervous bead of moisture rolled slowly down his temple. He scrambled to open his leather briefcase, his hands trembling noticeably as he pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slid the papers across the massive mahogany table directly toward me. It was a comprehensive, ironclad non-disclosure agreement, aggressively paired with a highly lucrative severance package containing hundreds of thousands of dollars in guaranteed hush money. He spoke rapidly, his voice entirely stripped of its usual commanding tone. He desperately promised to terminate Lance immediately, quietly, and permanently, offering me this massive financial payout if I simply agreed to sign my name, bury the Internet Protocol evidence, and walk away in silence. I looked down at the thick legal document resting on the polished wood. I slowly reached out, picked up the heavy stack of paper with both of my hands, and deliberately tore it perfectly in half right in front of their terrified faces. The sharp, violent sound of ripping paper echoed like a gunshot in the silent, glass-enclosed room. I casually let the torn pieces flutter down onto the table like worthless trash. I looked the lawyer dead in the eye and stated with absolute clarity that I had absolutely zero interest in accepting their dirty, desperate money. I informed them that exactly 30 minutes before I walked into this building, at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, I had already transmitted the complete, unredacted forensic evidence file directly to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, as well as several major national financial news outlets. The chief executive officer let out a choked, panicked gasp, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically struck. Right on cue, his expensive smartphone, resting near the edge of the table, began to vibrate uncontrollably. Then, the chief legal counsel's phone went off. Within seconds, the tense atmosphere of the room was entirely shattered by the frantic, relentless buzzing of incoming messages and emergency alerts from furious major shareholders. The morning stock market had officially opened for the day, and the devastating news of the federal banking disaster had already hit the trading floor. The highly inflated corporate shares of EtherCore Dynamics were currently experiencing a violent, catastrophic freefall, wiping out billions of dollars in market valuation in mere minutes. I stood tall, fully embracing the absolute power I held over their rapidly collapsing empire. I delivered my final, non-negotiable ultimatum. I demanded that EtherCore fully and publicly cooperate with all federal investigators, immediately handing over every single piece of internal data regarding Lance's criminal negligence. Furthermore, I demanded immediate, full financial compensation for every single information technology employee who had been systematically forced to work completely unpaid overtime for the past 1 year. Before anyone could even attempt to formulate a pathetic negotiation, the heavy glass door of the conference room forcefully swung open. 2 stern, heavily armed federal agents, flanked by our own terrified building security personnel, stepped confidently into the room. They completely ignored the executives and walked straight toward the trembling vice president. Lance was forcefully pulled to his feet. The cold, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists sounded like the triumphant final note of my grand symphony. The federal agents loudly read him his rights, officially charging him on the spot with massive financial fraud and the deliberate destruction of federal property. All of his previous arrogant swagger, his mocking smiles, and his toxic superiority completely dissolved into pathetic, breathless sobbing. He cried loudly, a broken, humiliating sound. As he was physically dragged out of the glass room and paraded down the main hallway under the intense, unforgiving stares of hundreds of silent employees, I calmly reached down, closed my personal laptop, and smoothly slid it into my leather briefcase. The chief legal counsel, still staring blankly at the torn contract on the table, stammered weakly. He nervously asked if I would consider returning to my position as the lead auditor once the dust settled and all my demands were fully met by the board. I walked toward the exit, stopping just before the doorway. I did not bother to turn my head to look back at the ruined, defeated men sitting in that room. I do not work for people who let their systems burn just to protect the ego of a pathetic man. Good luck with the ashes. I stepped out of the conference room and walked purposefully toward the executive elevator. I pressed the button for the ground floor, the metal doors sliding shut smoothly in front of me. I left behind a once untouchable corporate empire that was now burning to the ground, both literally and figuratively. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know down in the comments section. If you enjoyed this corporate revenge story and want to help keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community. Over there, you can listen to our most intense, exclusive true stories featuring incredible emotional voice acting that we simply cannot publish publicly on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or just click the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next story.